I'm on the board of directors of the Australian Legislative Ethics Commission. By profession, I'm a registered intensive care nurse. I'm also a forgotten Australian. And we help and support families whose children have been taken by the child protection system. Australia is the government child stealing capital of the world. I've just finished research on the world figures, and I can confirm that our government child protection departments have stolen more children per head of population than any other Western nation. And that is not a title to be proud of. It's one of great shame.
Shame! Shame!
Sadly, our governments have failed to learn the painful and destructive lessons of the past and have escalated the rate of child stealing in the last decade on the ludicrous premise that it's better to take a child on an unregistered caseworker's opinion because they might suffer some risk of harm at some time in the future if they are left with family, while at the same time they fail to acknowledge the far greater evidence harm to children that are forcibly removed and placed in care that is damaging lifelong consequences for both the child and the family. While the federal government keeps apologising to one stolen generation after another and acknowledges time and time again the harm state governments have inflicted on vulnerable children and families for decades, caused by the failure of the state child protection system, nothing has changed. Because there is too much power and no accountability in this corrupt industry. Child stealing by governments always has and always will be a total failure, as governments have been evidenced as the worst parents of all.
Yes! Yes!
We urgently need registration for all child protection workers so an independent government body can hold them to account for their misconduct.
Yes!
We urgently need a national complaints mechanism empowered with both investigative and prosecutorial powers, where parents and children can go with their evidence complaints of abuse, misconduct and crimes committed against them by the child protection industry every day.
Yes!
Australia has had more than 80 inquiries into children in state care in the last 160 years.
And they still got it wrong!
All have evidence the system is a failure. Governments have been more concerned with costs than the care of vulnerable children, making past inquiries more about damage control than actual reform. Children have been left exposed to a system that's more interested in economics than their best interest. Recommendations from these inquiries have not been implemented, and no one has been accountable for the lives destroyed. The current Senate inquiry into out-of-home care must result in recommendations that will be implemented as a priority of government. Saying sorry for past abuse and failures is meaningless while children are still being needlessly stolen, deaths and abuse of children in care are still happening and still being covered up by the multi-billion-dollar child protection industry that caters for the whims of the profiteering stakeholders, not our children and certainly not their families. 66% of the 50,000 children currently in care nationwide were forcibly removed for emotional harm and neglect. The high numbers of emotional harm are because of the children witnessing domestic violence of adult family members. So start protecting the victims, remove the violent perpetrators, not the child. The high number of neglect cases is due mainly to poverty. So let's help those families out of poverty and stop stealing their children.
Hey!
This statistic tells us that there's 33,000 stolen children currently in care that should have been helped and supported to remain with family. So let's restore those stolen children as soon as possible. While our governments talk of supporting families to stay together and only taking children as a last resort, we at Alcom know in practice these principles are being ignored and unregistered caseworkers are breaking laws and violating human rights every day. and no one is held accountable because there are no laws that compel the Child Protection Departments to support families. Only laws that support governments to forcibly remove children and keep them till they're 18 without any evidence or any case review, just the concern or opinion of an unregistered child protection worker, as no evidence is required in the secret care courts where there is no justice for children and families. The financial facts confirm what we know. Only 10% of funding nationally is spent to support families to stay together. 30% is spent on solicitors and legal costs to fight families to ensure they don't get their children back. The remaining 60% is spent on the cost of out-of-home care for the stolen children. The solution is easy. Abolish the secret care courts, as they are not needed, because only 3% of parents whose children have been forcibly removed have been found guilty of criminal abuse or neglect, and they are dealt with by the criminal courts. If there's no evidence that a parent has committed a crime against their children, then these families must be helped and supported to stay safely together. And with restoration of the children that should never have been removed in the first place, the funding figures reverse, and 90% of the billions of dollars currently wasted every year destroying lives and tearing families apart can be invested in prevention of child abuse and family support. I'll now share with you some recent cases that demonstrate the reality of child stealing at the front line every day all over this nation. Case number 1. An Indigenous baby was born in early September this year and stolen from the maternity ward by Fax New South Wales. The child's Indigenous grandmother was approved to supervise contact between the baby and his parents. The child was never harmed, and certainly at no risk of harm, with a capable and protective grandmother. There was no assessments done, there was no investigation, not even any risk of harm reports. There was no early intervention or help and support of any kind provided by the department. Sadly, last month, just 46 days after the forced removal of this newborn baby, when he was only 6 weeks old, an order was made by a magistrate well known to be a rubber stamp for the department, who refused to hear the testimony from the family. She just shut them down, and she granted orders of parental responsibility to the minister for this baby until he's 18 years old. His care plan, as I read it, was dated to end in the year 2032. With a rapidly decreasing contact regime for his parents over the next 10 weeks and no contact for his grandmother at all. This is how Krieg Elwood's new legislation, including forced adoptions as the priority for all babies taken into care within 6 months, is working in practice. This child has been permanently placed with non-Indigenous carers that wanted someone else's baby. There was an Aboriginal practice consultant involved who is employed by Fax. And her solution for this child's cultural development was that the carers have indicated that they are prepared to learn a little bit about Aboriginal culture. So clearly this baby was stolen in record time, just 46 days, to get a final order until he's 18 years old, and under new permanency laws has been earmarked for forced adoption. Case number 2. We've got a maternal grandmother who has full custody of one of her grandsons. The mother had a few mental health issues, and in order for the grandmother to be approved for custody of the grandson, she was forced by the department to take out a restraining order against her own daughter, which has caused considerable pain and forced family separation. When the mother gave birth to a second child, the department forcibly removed him. They refused to place the new baby with his maternal grandmother and his brother. Instead, they took him 100 kilometres away to another state and placed him with a very distant relative of the father, who was a stranger and is not known to the rest of the large family. The department calls this kinship placement. For over 2 years, this grandmother has fought unsuccessfully for the custody of the new grandson, and at the very least, some contact with herself and his brother. Contact has been denied. The department takes the view that this is not in that child's best interest. However, when I studied the case notes, it became very clear that the carers of the new baby are against facilitating contact. So the best interest of the child is actually the wishes of the foster carer, and most certainly not in the best interest of this child, his grandmother or his brother. They get away with using the term in the best interest of the children and abusing it because there's no legal definition for that term in care and protection legislation. This term was first used by Adolf Hitler and has been exploited by the Child Protection Departments ever since. So basically it can and does mean whatever an unregistered caseworker wants it to mean, and rarely from our experience are decisions about children in care made in their best interest. So both these brothers are denied contact with each other, one raised by a loving grandmother, surrounded by his extended family and culture, the other isolated from his family in another state hundreds of kilometres away with a so-called distant relative that no one else knows or has heard about before he was placed there. Case number 3, a young Indigenous boy heading for a forced adoption thanks to Prue Goward's evil social eugenic legislation that was made in March in New South Wales this year. He's the youngest of his mother's 4 boys. The first 3 boys are in her care and have always been in her care. They've never been removed. But late in her pregnancy for the 4th baby, she suffered some mental health issues because of past childhood trauma. Rather than helping and supporting this mother, Doc stole her 4th baby and placed him with an non-Indigenous white foster carer who is single and wanted a baby. In stealing her son, this mother's recovery was severely impeded, which is understandable because even if you had no mental health issues before your child was stolen, you certainly will have them afterwards. Since this mother's recovery, she has fought for the return of her 4th son without any success. The reason this mother has not been successful with restoration or even more contact is because the foster carer has bonded with this young boy and wants to keep him. So has done everything she could to prevent the mother having more contact and even illegally using her own surname for this child. The department have supported the carer and the care court rubber stamped what the department want and denied restoration to his mother and 3 brothers because they decided it was not in the child's best interest as he was settled in his placement and had developed a bond with this white foster carer. This situation is very common. White foster carers have no legal rights and are supposed to care for children only until they're able to be returned to their families. But in reality, they hold far too much power and control over children in their care and obstruct restoration of families to meet their own selfish needs to have someone else's child. And the department not only allows the wishes of the foster carer to form the basis of their decisions, but they actually grant the wishes of the foster carer. The foster carer now wants to proceed to adoption, and the department, of course, have supported the foster carer, and now that forced adoptions are legal in New South Wales, it's up to us to raise our voices, use our keyboards to help this mother fight to save her son from forced adoption and have him rightfully restored to his Indigenous family who love him. So despite all the propaganda from Prue about Indigenous children being exempt from forced adoption because it was not acceptable to culture, it clearly is happening. Forced adoption should be outlawed, not made legal. Adoption is for orphans and not children that have loving families. Case number 4, a mother who was university educated, very talented in the arts, developed some mental health issues after the birth of her only child. These were exacerbated at the end of the pregnancy by the hormones, which is understandable. She was placed on quite a lot of medication by the hospital psychiatrist from the mental health unit. Her husband was very concerned about the side effects of this medication at times because his wife was drowsy and it affected her balance. He became quite vocal in his objections about the medication being prescribed for his wife. He then had to leave work to care for his wife and new daughter. One day his wife slipped on their tiled floor and was injured, so he took her to hospital, where she presented as very anxious, and they ended up admitting her to the mental health unit under the care of a psychiatrist the father didn't like and had concerns about, because he was the one that had given the wife so much medication that she was unstable in her balance and fell and hurt herself. Once his wife was admitted, he took his young daughter home to care for her. Next thing, the police and docs arrived on his doorstep and forcibly removed his daughter because the psychiatrist, who didn't like this father, decided to put in a mandatory report that he suspected the father had caused the injuries to his wife that she'd sustained in the fall. The psychiatrist then placed his wife under the care of the public guardian, so the state had control of her finances, and scheduled her under the Mental Health Act, so he had full control of her treatment, and the husband was rendered powerless. The allegations were false. His wife testified to the fact that he was a loving, caring father, had never been violent, and he was also cleared by the police investigation. But there's no justice in the care court at all, because no evidence is required, and right from the start the department sought an 18-year order, and the department got what they wanted. These parents have lost their only daughter, who has been sentenced to foster care till she's 18, and they could not even appeal the case to the district court, where they would have won, because in that jurisdiction they do require evidence, because the public guardian had control of the family's finances and refused to release the money so they could pay a good solicitor to bring their daughter home. His daughter has been abused in care and no one has been held accountable. The father was only granted 4 contacts a year. Contact with your children only 4 times a year is grossly inadequate and has been a common order handed down by care courts for the past decade. And I struggle to find any scientific research of the origins of how this phenomenon began. And it seems from discovery that someone high up in the department pulled that figure out of the air to suit them as the standard baseline, as the number of children in out-of-home care skyrocketed to unmanageable numbers. And it's certainly not in any child or family's best interest. 2 more cases to go briefly. Case number 5. A mother was a victim of domestic violence. She'd left her husband, set herself and her 3 children up in a new location. Her ex-husband was having access safely by family members. Her husband tracked her down, drove his car into her home and abducted the 3 children. No one would help her or her children. The police said it was a domestic kidnap, despite the long criminal violent history of the ex-husband. They told her to go to the family law court, but she didn't have any money for a solicitor and legal aid wouldn't support her. Meanwhile, the ex-husband left the oldest daughter with a maternal grandmother one day because he wanted to go out with a new girlfriend, so the mother got her back. The 2 youngest children were found at about 4 o'clock in the morning one day outside an ATM machine, abandoned. The police found them and they called docs. The father and his girlfriend were located some stage later under the influence of drugs. But instead of returning these children to their loving mother and sister, the department decided they'd take a 1-year order. They promised in the care plans that they would assist the mother to restore the children to her care and outline what they do to do this. They also required the mother to do a number of courses, including domestic violence education. The mother completed everything asked of her and more. The department did nothing that they promised to do. They promised the mother she could have the children for increasing contact, including the school holidays, and when the time came, they refused. So the mother made an application to have the children returned to her. The department not only opposed the mother's application, but blatantly colluded with the ex-husband, who didn't want the children, but didn't want the mother to have the children, to the point that they brought him into the doc's office, assisted him to write an affidavit and filed it for him. And that affidavit was full of lies and defamation about the mother.
Mary.
Now on with the false allegation.
You're going to have workshops over there.
Okay. Okay, so I'll tell you the other stories. There was another 2. The last one is a good story because these children were taken. I'll just tell you very simply. They were taken one night.
You're going to have workshops over there.
Okay. Alright, so today we call on the governments of Australia to stop stealing our children and bring our stolen children home.
Hey, well done, Mary.